I think it goes without saying that COVID-19 had a pretty big impact on New York this past spring. New York's Governor Cuomo was in the news a lot during that time, and I want to take a look at one conclusion he drew from some data in early May that was widely reported. He expressed surprise at the results of this survey of hospitalized New York COVID-19 patients, that 66%, almost two-thirds, reported that they had mostly stayed home in the weeks leading up to when they got sick. So, from the perspective of a data scientist, I immediately asked the question, should he have been surprised? Now, I certainly see where he's coming from here. We can probably agree that it makes sense that the more you're out and about, the more likely you are to get sick. And staying home and isolated should lower your chance. And clearly from these data, most of the people who got sick were staying home. But I'd suggest there's just not enough information here to say whether it's right to call this surprising or shocking in this case. Regardless, it offers a nice example of maybe one of the most important things you should have in your toolkit when it comes to drawing conclusions or inferences from data. And that thing is the null. Sometimes the null hypothesis, the null expectation, the null scenario, whatever you call it. As scientists, we think about and use the null all the time when trying to interpret data. And understanding and considering the null is absolutely crucial. So, what is the null exactly? Well, it's basically what you expect results to look like if the variable you're interested in has no effect. The statistic that 66% of individuals hospitalized with the virus had stayed home has to be thought of in the context of what proportion of the entire population, whether they were sick or not, were staying home. Let's look at an example with two different types of people. The first will represent essential workers in New York at the time. My wife is a hospital employee, and she hasn't missed a day of work throughout the pandemic, so I'm using a healthcare worker here. The next is somebody like me. Now, I've been working from home on my computer since early March, and really haven't been out much beyond what's been necessary. Let's first consider a scenario where half the population stayed home and half were out like normal. Now, let's say 10 of the people got sick and went to the hospital. If lifestyle, being out or not, has no effect, the expectation would be that 50%, or 5 of the 10, would be individuals who had been out a lot, and 50% would come from those who stayed home. That's the null expectation in this case. Now, let's take a different scenario. Here, 10% of the people were out like normal, and 90% were staying home. In this case, if 10 people got sick, we'd expect, again, if lifestyle has no effect, that 9 of the 10 would have been staying home, and 1 would have been out as normal. And that represents the null for this scenario. In this case, it's really different than the null expectation of 50-50 that we determined for the previous hypothetical. To say whether 66% is surprising, that 66% has to be evaluated in the context of the null. Here, in the bottom right, I've recreated this plot focusing in on the 66% bar and relabeled it a bit for clarity. Again, that 66% represents the fraction of sick people who stayed home. Now, beside that, I'm going to plot hypothetical data points that could represent the fraction of all people who stayed home. For example, if 30% of individuals were staying home, that 66% that we observed would represent more than double the null, and might suggest that staying home somehow makes you more likely to get sick. If 66% of all folks were staying home, then the result would be consistent with the null, and that would provide no evidence of any effect of lifestyle either way. And if 90% of all people were staying home, then that 66% is less than the expectation under the null, and might indicate staying home decreases your risk of getting sick. The take-home message here, considering the null is critically important when drawing conclusions from data. If you find yourself starting to look at data from some study, it's one of the first places your thought process should go. Sometimes determining the null is intuitive and simple, and sometimes it's not, but it's always really important. Hope that might be helpful to some of you. If it was, feel free to like or subscribe to get information on similar videos.